one way of answering this question is to repeat what I said in my earlier talk for Essentia, because there I'm talking about what do we mean by reality. Is it something that is simply out there, or is it something simply made up in our heads? And I'm trying to suggest that it's something more complex than either of these, that doesn't rule out our role in making it what it is, but doesn't suggest that we just somehow make it all up. So it's a complicated process, but I think my best attempt to explain it is in that article I contributed to the website. But I think the important thing is to come back to the perception, which for me is so important, that all reality is relations. It's not things. Things are secondary to relations. And I do actually argue, and I'm with a number of physicists, that relata, the things that are related, are secondary to the relationships. So it's not that there are first things, and then because there are things, there are relationships between them, but there are relationships, and out of the web of interconnections congeal, as it were, or come further and further into our sight, nodes where threads cross, and it's these things that attract our attention. We call them things. We see them as things, separate things, but actually they're all part of a network. And I sometimes quote here the image of Indra's net, which is in the Vedanta, this idea of a net that covers the cosmos. And in the net, at every place where one thread crosses another, there is suspended a bead or a pearl in which all the rest of the net is imaged. So everything is interconnected. And so when we say what is real, we appear to be asking the question, what is really the case if I stopped having a relationship with it? But that would immediately invalidate its being real, because things are only real in as much as they are relational. What we can do, though, is inhabit many different viewpoints. So what is objectivity? It's not inhabiting a very odd viewpoint, which is one in which you pretend that you actually have no responses, no feelings, about whatever it is you're looking at, something that actually no human being has ever been able to achieve and wouldn't really be desirable as a way of securing truth. In most cases, if I am asked about something, I need to enter into some sort of relationship to find out what it is. Otherwise, I'm in the position of a Martian looking at something that I completely don't understand, is utterly alien to me, and trying to make sense of it. So instead of objectivity being an idea of an unrealizable and indeed undesirable detachment, it's about varying one's point of view as fairly as one can, to take in as many points of view as seem valuable in contributing something to this picture. So the mind of the objective person is not one in which all other viewpoints, other than one very peculiar, cold, clinical way of thinking, is active, but the exact opposite, a kind of mentation in which all kinds of perspectives are being entertained and tried out to see which ones are most revealing. So in that sense, it's the way we take in anything that we like. In a Zen garden, we don't just sit in one place, but we walk around, and the garden looks different from different points of view. Interestingly, in the case of one Zen garden, famous one called Ryanji, although there are 15 stones or 15 rocks in the garden, there is no place from which you can see all 15, which is something I like very much, because it seems to me to, in a way, reflect on what I was saying, is there is no one viewpoint from which you can see everything, but by inhabiting different viewpoints, you stand the best chance of seeing a reality. It doesn't mean to say you have to accept each one of them to the same extent. You may think one of them is enormously more important and revealing than another, which is natural, so that's fine. But it's not a matter of there being a reality that we can discover. And here again, I come back to that saying of Bohr about physics, that we are not trying to be able to demonstrate the inner nature of something, which is always in a way beyond our capacity to do, but instead to see the patterns of relationships between what we know. And that is the progress of science, to make sense of what it is that we know. And it should be as broad in its embrace of things that we experience and as broad in the ways in which it approaches that as is possible. And then to take a reasonable judgment on them. And then testing out ideas against reality. Sorry. Well, yes, a third-person study of something like consciousness will only produce peripheral knowledge, such as changes in certain brain activities under certain circumstances. But those changes in whatever the brain is doing is not, despite one or two perverse opinions voiced by philosophers I shan't name, is not the same thing as the experience. So I can fall in love, and undoubtedly there will be changes in my brain if I fall in love. Everything I do, from filling the car with petrol and eating a sandwich and looking at the stars, has a brain correlate. But when you can demonstrate to me what that brain correlate is, you haven't told me anything about what that experience was, the true experience. So this is a problem which seems to have escaped a lot of researchers into consciousness, because, for example, they will say, we can show that consciousness actually has its origin in, as I believe Mark Soames says, in the brainstem. That may be, but it hasn't told us what consciousness is. What it tells us is that given the existence of consciousness, which we're doing nothing to explain, it seems that the brainstem has a very important part to play in a human's experience of consciousness. But too often in science, we miss the fact that we are taking for granted the very thing that we should be questioning. If we're prepared to take for granted consciousness, it exists, then we can ask these other questions, like where are the correlates in the brain and so on. But we've got no nearer to saying what consciousness is. And we can't get nearer to saying what love is by looking at graphs or doing anything that involves lab work. But it doesn't make love unreal. Love's one of the most real things in life. So that would be my take on that. And interesting, because it's worth saying about value as well. Darwin was enormously taken by and expressive of his love for and his reaction to the beauty of nature. In his Descent of Man, I think either the word beauty or beautiful occurs on a very high proportion of pages. I do quote the figures in the book, I can't now remember. It's repeated over and over again. And people think that they can tell me what beauty is and is for, because they say, well, obviously it helps mate selection and so on. That's fine. And Darwin, of course, wouldn't have disagreed at all with the fact that given the existence of beauty, it can be used in this finite game sort of way. But looking more towards the infinite game, what is beauty at all? Where does it come from? And Darwin twice expresses complete puzzlement and says that we get no closer to knowing where or how beauty ever came about. Once we take for granted the existence of beauty, we can say, yes, it can be used for this, it can be used for that. But the fact that it can be used for this and used for that doesn't say that's all that it is, or that is its purpose. There are many things that we may do to express our being alive, but they're not necessarily the purpose for which we are alive. And so in the case of beauty, one finds oneself laughably reduced to the suggestion that it has something to do with mate selection only. I mean, it does have to do with that, but good grief. So is that really the reason that a desert place is beautiful, that the ice cap of a mountain is beautiful, that the equation e to the I pi equals -1 is beautiful, that a chess move is beautiful, that a Zen garden is beautiful, that a minor third is beautiful, that Schubert's C major quintet is beautiful? No. So it's extraordinary, the capacity for science to blind itself to the very narrow hole in which it's digging and to answer all questions with relation to that. not being able to see the vast canvas that it's ignoring. Yes. There's nothing in science that says that reductionism is the way to do it or is somehow more scientific than other ways of doing science. And that's why I devote 3 chapters to science in The Matter with Things, looking at its strengths, which I profoundly believe in and rely on, both in my career and in my personal life, as we all do. What its strengths are, what its limitations are, because it can't be thought to answer all our questions. That's a simple logical error. And what comes from the different models which it uses. So if it uses the machine model, or if it uses the model of a process, such as the flow of a river, and the ways in which it gets distorted by inevitable pressures in the institution of science. So I look at all those. Yes, what can we do about it? Well, one of the things we could do would be to stop thinking that we get closer to something by simply taking it apart. We get closer to understanding it by simply taking it apart and by taking it out of context. I argue very strongly that once you change the context, you change whatever it is you're looking at. And once you take it out of context altogether, you have utterly changed it. Also, that when you take it apart, you don't necessarily find the key to what it is. You may have just thrown away everything that made it what it was. Again, an example might be a sonata by Haydn. And you ask me, what is it? It's a lot of music. What is music? It's a lot of different tones, different notes that are sung or played or whatever. What is a tone or a note? Let me have a look at these notes. And I write them all down in a book and catalogue all the notes that are in the sonata. It won't tell me anything at all about the sonata. As soon as you start breaking it up, you've lost the very thing you were looking at. So I think the move towards a proper balance between the knowledge that does come to us from analysis, but must be taken back into a syncretic or synthetic view that is able to compose something again that makes sense. A balance between the processes for division and those for union, with those processes for union always being, if you like, preferred, superior, or at a meta level more important than the ones for division. It's a point that I make time and time again, that we need the union of union and division. We need both union and division, but we need them to be unified. And when people say we need, non-duality, I say, well, yes, but we also need duality, but we need the duality or the non-duality of non-duality and duality. So in this case, what I'm really saying is there's nothing wrong with analysis. It tells us very much. It's quite true. But if you are asking it to help you understand it rather than just to change something, manipulate it, then you need to be able to bring this knowledge into a larger syncretic understanding. In terms of what the hemispheres contribute to science, and they both contribute massively to science, it's clear from the descriptions of the processes that led great scientists and mathematicians to their key discoveries that processes that we know are associated more with the right hemisphere than the left were the crucial parts in the process. There was also a lot of rather pedestrian, serial analytic work going on for years, it's true, but the actual insight, the knowledge, the understanding of what was being dealt with comes from a kind of insight which is much better given by the right hemisphere, which understands a bigger, broader picture. So in effect, I think we need to make science more scientific. It's too unscientific at the moment. For example, science shouldn't have dogmas that it won't look at certain things. Consciousness is on the fringe of one of these dogmas. It's not entirely excluded, but there are certain scientists who wouldn't wish science to have anything to do with such a philosophical concept, as though science and philosophy could be distinguished. If you don't understand the relationship between science and philosophy, then you've simply naively accepted a philosophy of mechanism and materialism without realizing that you've done it, because that is the unspoken philosophy, for what it's worth, of much science as now practiced. But science needs to be much more than that. It needs to be open to the possibilities that it's missing things. It needs to be skeptical, but it needs to be not dogmatically skeptical. It needs to be able to examine things and be just and fair in its appraisal of them. And I don't think that is the case in much of the work that aims to help us understand processes that are not material and mechanical only. It's the same thing that I was talking about, that just because there is a brain, and it's quite true, you can watch it and measure it and see it changing, that's all there is. There's nothing in the looking at the brain that tells you that everything that is visible in your view of the brain. I actually conceive that some of the most interesting parts of psychiatry are the neurological parts. I'm delighted by the beautiful things that we learn about the workings of the brain, but I see those as telling us more about what a human being is. In other words, they need to be absorbed into a philosophy of human life, which is really, as Schrödinger said, the great physicist said, that specialized knowledge about detailed areas in science is only useful in as much as it eventually contributes to the understanding of what we are and what we're doing in this world. Addressing that question took me 12 years and 1,500 pages, and that is the book, The Matter with Things. We mustn't think of purpose as necessarily something that was somebody else's purpose, because we see purposes as being manifested in things that we make, expressions of a desire we have, that if we or any parts of the world were to be purposeful, we'd ask, well, whose purposes? There must be a God, there must be an engineering God who designs this. But this is just an image dreamt up by the left hemisphere of a super left hemisphere. God as an engineer who makes everything happen according to a mechanism, and puts in a hand occasionally to correct things when they go slightly out of balance, puts a few drops of oil into the machine from time to time. But this is just getting us no further than the idea of there being no purpose. But as I said, there are purposes that are not parts of finite games, instrumental purposes. Well, there's no purpose in your studying music. There's no purpose in your enjoying the garden. There's no purpose in being in love and having a family. Well, there may be no purpose in that narrow sense, but these things would be wrongly described as without purpose, because they have purpose in another meaning of that word, which is not instrumental, but is that they are going somewhere. They are answering an attraction. They are parts of the world call to us and we respond to it. And indeed, we call to parts of the world and they respond to us. I don't hold with the idea that this is a one-way process involving an entirely insensate cosmos. The cosmos is conscious and responsive, and so are we. So the purpose is not something that could be attributed as a goal can be to a mechanical purpose. It's a purpose that fulfills itself in the very process of coming into being. And that's what the really deep purposes in life are. What was the purpose of my writing that book? It wasn't actually to change anybody's mind. It was something that had no purpose at the time I was writing it. I just felt the strong need to respond to what I saw in the world. And that was the purpose that drove me to do it. I mean, in the end, the purpose was more powerful than I was, because I really didn't want to carry on. But the purpose was saying, no, you have to carry on. You must do this. Much as I suppose as a parent, you may come to a time when you think, oh, God, why did I ever become a parent? But you can't go, no, I'm not going to be a parent. You have to carry on. And in that carrying on, the purposeness of life, the purposeness of the fulfilling nature of being who one is, which can only be found in unpacking potential. That is the kind of purpose that we have. Three things that are very, very clear to me and very clearly substantiated by a mass of research evidence are that there are three things above all that make people well, sane, in other words, in body and mind, happy, fulfilled, resistant to crises, more resistant to illnesses. There are three things that are more important than stopping smoking, losing weight, or going to the gym, or whatever it might be. And those three things are belonging to a coherent tradition, a social group that carry out processes where that group extends over time and space and is one of mutuality. So the relational, interhuman concept of a society. The second is relationship with nature, that just being in nature can change your capacity to think clearly, can change your emotional range so that you don't feel so angry and aggressive. It can change your happiness very strongly, but it can also change the levels of heart disease. And for those who are interested in the physical health more than anything, it's a very profound effect that we get from being in contact with nature. And the third thing is being in touch with a spiritual realm, believing in a spiritual dimension, preferably belonging to a group that has common practices together, worships together, has rituals in common, but not necessarily just simply believing that there is more than is summed up in the very simplistic, morally and imaginatively and intellectually naive vision of a cosmic mechanism. And what have we done? We have helped destroy the continuity of our communities. We have rejected history, tradition, and everything that is not the product of some logical formula that we have decided now is more important. We have alienated ourselves from nature. Until 100 years ago, most people lived where they lived in a natural context. And that also expresses for us an idea of the bigger whatever it is that we belong to, not just the tiny person that I am in a flat in a city. And the third thing is, we've done is to cut ourselves off from the spiritual and religious life by saying, well, only somebody who's simple-minded would believe such things. In my view, only someone who is simple-minded would be convinced by an argument that there cannot be such a thing. So we're in the process of committing suicide. It's not a purpose of mine to stop us, because we probably can't. I can't stop people committing suicide. I'd love to say I could, because I have children, I have grandchildren. But it's up to all of us to reconceive the world, to reconceive what life is, to reconceive the cosmos, which is beautiful and complex and responsive and tells us something about the nature of existence. So if we lack all of that, then we're losing the plot, as we say, and we can expect things to just disintegrate. I'm not a very strong, adherent to one particular religion. I see great value in most of the religions I know, but the reason that things are going wrong in our world is because men have forgotten God. And I think there's an awful lot in that, because in that is packed up a whole idea of the way in which we live and who we are. So although people are inclined to reject these ideas, I think we ought to be careful before we reject them. They may contain great wisdom. a distinction of that kind is perfectly reasonable. The way in which I would mainly consider it is the distinction between the way the right hemisphere is able to understand the world, including the way the left hemisphere understands it, but seeing much more, and the way the left hemisphere understands it, which is just a very simple version. And one of the differences between the two hemispheres is that the left hemisphere represents what was present or presenced to the right hemisphere. So the right hemisphere is where we have this encounter with experience, and it is then immediately replaced by a representation, which literally means present again after the fact, when the thing is actually no longer present. This is a profoundly important distinction, because we have got used to living in representations of the world without actually experiencing the presence of it. One of the purposes of mindfulness is to re-engage our capacity to be present and to allow the world to presence to us. And most people who practice that, virtually everyone who practices it, says it is a life-transforming experience, that they see the world differently. Well, this is because they're re-engaging the part of us which you might well call the heart, and over and above the simple model of the left hemisphere's representation, which is always mechanical, which is always linear, which is always two-dimensional, replacing it by the three-dimensional. And I'm not speaking just figuratively about two-dimensional and three-dimensional. I go into the neurology of all these things, the differences between right and left hemisphere. It's very, very clear that when people have dysfunction of the right hemisphere, they start to see the world two-dimensionally in space and two-dimensionally in time, as made up of slices that are static, not a flow any longer. And seeing the world as flat, like on a screen, such as we are looking at now. So, yes, all these things are ways of killing what you might call the soul, killing. Yes, I think what the word soul is possibly even better than the word heart. And what's kind of interesting in German is that the word Geist, which is the word for intellect, also is the word for spirit. And it's a word that already carries with it the idea that it is more than a purely intellectual process. And we now know that, just out of interest, I wouldn't set an enormous amount of store by it, but we know that the heart actually does have an electromagnetic field around it, which can be sensed by other people. I think it's extensive to something like 12 feet around the person. And make of it what you will. I know that there was a surgeon who did heart transplants at Papworth Hospital, which is a big key centre for such transplants in Britain, and he finally gave up doing them because he was so unnerved by the changes in personality that came when people received another person's heart. And they started to prefer and like things that before the heart transplant they hadn't, but which were completely typical of the donor of the heart. Now, make what you like of that. I just say there are many things that we don't understand. What I like is that physicists tend to be very good at accepting there's just a lot we don't understand. In fact, they're much better at this than biologists. Biologists tend to convey the idea that we've nearly cracked it. Just a few more experiments and we really understand the essence of things. But there's something called the Dunning-Kruger effect in psychology, which means that the more intelligent you are, the more you understand how little you understand. And the less intelligent and insightful you are, the more you think you know everything. And I'm afraid the left hemisphere tends literally to go to, no, I don't have a problem, it lies somewhere else. I'm not just speaking figuratively here. I'm talking about what happens to somebody if they have a right hemisphere stroke. The person simply overestimates their capacities, has a higher opinion of themselves than is warranted, thinks they're able to do things that they can't. It doesn't happen after a left hemisphere stroke when the right hemisphere is now in charge. So these are tangible truths about differences between the hemispheres. And Einstein was often quoted as saying things like that he believed certainly certain things, like that he could rule out the existence of God. In fact, he's known to have said, not that he knew anything about a religion, and he thought that a personal religion might be a rather childish idea, but that he was very cross when people quoted him as a reason for disbelieving in God. What he actually said was, when it comes to questions of this kind, it is completely beyond the capacity of a human brain. So if he was humble enough, and he was a humble man in many ways, to recognize the extent of the things he didn't know, why do so many biologists find it so difficult? It's an interesting question, often puzzles me. I can quote a score of physicists who express this wonderful sense of not knowing, which is a very fertile place to be in order actually to come to understand things. As Erwin Chargaff said in his wonderful intellectual autobiography, Heraclitean Fire, that biologists don't seem to understand the value of unknowing, but physicists really do. And in that tradition of all the great thinkers and mystics of the past, that it's only in actually understanding the limits on our knowledge that we can come to have greater understanding.